The desert keeps its secrets better than any king. At sunrise, when the first blade of gold slices across the Giza plateau, the pyramids glow like they have been forged from light itself. No matter how many times travelers have stood before them, the moment always steals the breath from their lungs. But on this particular morning, it was not a traveler who paused in awe. It was an archaeologist, one who had spent decades staring into the past and still felt humbled by what the ancients left behind. Dr. Leila stepped out of her tent as the horizon blushed with dawn. The heat had not yet arrived. The world was quiet, as if holding its breath. Sand whispered around her boots as she walked toward the Great Pyramid, her measuring tools clinking softly against her belt. She had spent the last 6 months studying something that most visitors never noticed: the cuts in the stone. Most people stared upward, marveling at the architecture, at the immensity. Leila stared downward. She knelt at the base of a limestone block worn smooth by time. With practiced care, she slid a thin copper blade between 2 stones and felt resistance. She pressed again, harder this time, but the blade refused to enter the seam. "Impossible," she murmured. There was no gap, no crack, no space at all. 2.5-ton blocks, carved and shaped by hands from 4,500 years ago, sat against one another with a precision modern builders struggle to match. You could not fit a sheet of paper, a human hair, or even a grain of sand between them. The joint was so perfect it might have been welded, except stone does not weld. She leaned close, letting her fingertips brush the surface. The texture was soft, familiar, warm from absorbing night's cool. She closed her eyes. How? It was the question every archaeologist asked, from the first explorers to the newest graduate student. How did they shape stone with such impossible precision, without steel tools, without motors, without machines? The answer had died millennia ago, but the evidence remained, block after block, as if taunting the present. Behind her, a voice called out, "Still chasing the ghosts?" She turned to see Tomas Albright, her old friend and partner on countless digs, his face shadowed beneath a broad hat. He carried a thermos of coffee and a smile too tired for morning. "Not chasing," Leila replied. "Listening." Tomas laughed, chuckling. "Stones don't talk. These do," she whispered. She stood and pointed toward the northern base of the pyramid, where the stones caught the sun like polished bronze. "Look, each one shaped so precisely that even after 4,000 years of earthquakes, erosion, and looting, they still sit like a seamless puzzle." Tomas stepped behind her, kneeling just as she had. He ran a hand along the joint and let out a low whistle. "You know," he said softly, "every time I see this, I feel like the ancient builders are laughing at us." Leila smiled faintly. "Not laughing, teaching." The sun climbed higher, revealing what daylight always revealed: the scale. Millions of blocks, each carved to shape, each placed intentionally, each part of a larger geometry that scientists still could not fully explain. But it wasn't the architecture that haunted Leila the most. It was the craftsmanship, the skill, the human touch that defied everything modern tools insisted was necessary. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small stone fragment recovered from an old quarry wall. It was granite, hard, stubborn, almost unbreakable. She held it up to Tomas. "This," she said, "is from Aswan. The ancient workers didn't have iron chisels strong enough to cut this. They had copper, soft, bendable. Copper should lose every fight with granite." And yet, Tomas finished, it didn't. They stared at the fragment together, 2 minds tangled in mystery. Leila ran her thumb along the smooth edge. It wasn't jagged, the way broken stone normally appeared. It was polished, graceful, almost elegant. "Imagine," she said, "thousands of men striking stone for years, day after day, the rhythm of labor, the patience of time." Tomas took a sip of coffee. "So you still believe the answer is technique? What else could it be? If they had machines, we would have found them. If they had secret materials, we would have discovered traces." She paused, her gaze drifting up the pyramid slope. "No, what they had was knowledge. Knowledge we've forgotten." A breeze swept across the plateau, carrying with it the scent of dust and the faint cry of a bird circling overhead. The world felt ancient, older than memory, older than language. Leila walked toward the shadow cast by the Great Pyramid and placed her hand upon its stone. Warm, rough, eternal. She felt, as she often did, that the stone was not dead, but dormant, like a book written in a language modern people could no longer read. "Every civilization," she said softly, "leaves behind a signature. Rome left concrete, Mesopotamia left writing, Egypt left precision." Tomas nodded. "And we still don't understand how they did it." Leila turned to him, eyes bright with determination. "Then let's understand it, not from textbooks, not from speculation, but from the stones themselves." She began walking toward the edge of the plateau, where a line of jeeps waited to take the team south, to Aswan, to the quarries, to the birthplace of every pyramid block. Tomas followed her, adjusting his hat against the rising sun. "Back to the quarries?" he asked. "Yes," Leila replied. "If you want to understand a masterpiece, you start where the first stroke was made." As they reached the jeep, Tomas paused. "Do you really believe we can uncover the full technique, all of it?" Leila smiled, her expression both hopeful and haunted. "I believe the Egyptians left us clues, and if we learn to see as they saw, to feel stone as they did, the truth will reveal itself." The engine hummed to life. The desert stretched before them, endless and golden, hiding secrets beneath every grain. Leila placed her hand on her notebook, where a single question was written on the first page. How did they cut stone so perfectly without machines? As the jeep rolled forward, the question echoed in her mind like a drumbeat, pulling her deeper into the sands of history, into the quarries of forgotten skill, into the heart of a mystery older than any pharaoh. The riddle had stood for thousands of years, but now, at last, someone was listening. The journey to Aswan was like traveling backward through time. As the jeep sped along the desert road, the modern world slowly melted away. Buildings thinned, electric poles vanished, and the air filled with the raw scent of sand and sunburnt stone. By the time the Nile appeared, shimmering like an obsidian ribbon under the sky, Leila felt as though she were leaving her era entirely. They crossed into the Aswan quarry region just as the sun began its merciless climb. The granite mountains rose around them, cracked by centuries of heat, their surfaces glowing like embers. The landscape felt alive, vibrating with ancient labor. The deeper they drove, the stronger the feeling grew. They were entering a place where history had not ended, only paused. Tomas shaded his eyes. "So this is where the giants were born." Leila smiled. "Yes, every block of the Great Pyramid, every sarcophagus, every monolithic obelisk, they all began here." The Aswan quarries were unlike any place on Earth. Not natural formations, but scars, intentional, massive scars carved into the bedrock by hands long turned to dust.
The air trembled with heat. The ground glittered with fragments of pink and black granite, and all around them lay the silent tools of a vanished workforce.
Leila stepped out of the jeep and felt the heat push against her like a living force. She walked forward, slowly, reverently, as though stepping into a cathedral. Tomas followed behind her, his boots crunching on ancient shards. "Look," Leila whispered, pointing to a massive granite trench. The unfinished obelisk. Half carved, half bound to the earth, it stretched beneath them like the skeleton of a stone leviathan. 42 meters long, weighed over 1,000 tons, abandoned mid-birth. Cracks ran along its spine, caused by a single flaw that forced the Egyptians to leave it where it lay. But everything else, everything about it, was perfect. Tomas stared in disbelief. How did they even start this? Leila knelt beside the trench wall. Dozens, hundreds of shallow circular pits marked the surface. Each one had been created by pounding stones called dolerite balls, swung by the quarry workers with superhuman endurance. She picked up one such ball from the dust. It was smooth, dark, heavy as a heart. "This," she said, holding it out, "was their hammer."
Tomas took the stone and nearly dropped it. This is what carved the obelisks? Leila nodded. Dolerite is one of the hardest stones in the world, harder than granite. A team of workers would strike the same spot thousands of times until the granite cracked exactly where they wanted. Thousands? Tomas asked. Try millions. He turned the stone over in his hands, respect lighting his eyes. And we complained about long workdays? Leila smiled faintly and walked toward the trench, placing her palm against the granite surface. It was warm, smooth in some places, rough in others, a tapestry of unspoken stories. "I want you to imagine something," she said softly. "Imagine the sound of hundreds of dolerite balls striking granite at once, a thunder of stone. Imagine the rhythm, constant, endless, echoing through this valley day and night." Tomas closed his eyes, letting the idea sink in. Leila continued. "This place wasn't quiet. It wasn't abandoned. It was alive, full of sweat, noise, dust, and purpose." She motioned toward a path leading deeper into the quarry. They began walking, following grooves carved into the bedrock, ancient channels where workers once dragged massive blocks to the river. Some grooves were as deep as a man's shin, worn smooth by countless sleds. These were the fingerprints of a civilization. Farther ahead they reached a lower excavation area where tools still lay untouched, as though the workers might return at any moment. Copper chisels, flattened by impact. Worn ropes. Broken pottery jars that once carried water to the laborers. Everything preserved in silence. Tomas looked around in awe. It feels like time just stopped. Leila knelt beside a block half cut from the bedrock. The cut was astonishing. Straight, true, consistent. No modern power saw could have done better. "You see this?" she said. "This is where the riddle begins. Granite is one of the toughest materials on Earth. You can't cut it with copper. You can't shape it with bronze. You need steel or diamond-tipped tools, and the Egyptians didn't have either. So how did they? Patience." Leila traced the cut with her fingers. They used copper saws with sand. Tomas blinked. "Sand?" "Yes. hard quartz sand. They poured it into the cut, added water, and dragged the copper saw back and forth. The sand did the actual cutting. The copper just held the sand in place. So the sand was the blade. Exactly. And with enough time, enough control of pressure, direction, rhythm, they created cuts so perfect we still struggle to match them. Tomas shook his head. It's brilliant. Primitive, but brilliant. Leila stood and walked toward a high ledge overlooking the entire quarry. From up there, the scale of the operation became clear. Blocks the size of cars, trenches the length of swimming pools, pathways carved by generations of laborers, and above it all, the desert sun, watching silently. There's something else, Leila said. She pointed toward a long, narrow trench running deep into the rock. That, she said, is where they tested the straightness of their cuts. They didn't rely solely on tools. They relied on experience, on how stone responded, on how it sounded. To an Egyptian quarry master, stone spoke. A wrong strike had a sharp ring. A perfect strike had a deep, warm tone. They shaped granite the way a musician tunes strings. The wind picked up, scattering dust across the quarry floor. For a moment, Tomas imagined he could hear it, faint, rhythmic tapping buried beneath the wind. The ghosts of workers long gone. Leila touched his arm. "Do you hear it?" she asked. Tomas listened again. Tap, tap, tap. He swallowed. Yes, those are echoes of the quarry. They never truly stop.
Together, they stood in silence, letting the cries of ancient labor drift around them. The heat rose, the shadows shortened, and the mystery of Egyptian stonework, of perfect cuts made without machines, grew deeper and more alive with every passing second. Leila took out her notebook and wrote one sentence. To understand the stones, we must understand the hands that shaped them. The journey into the past had truly begun. The deeper Leila and Tomas explored the Aswan quarry, the more the silence felt like a living thing, watching them, judging them, waiting for them to understand. It was the silence of thousands of forgotten hands, of craftsmen whose mastery had shaped empires, yet whose names had vanished into desert winds. By mid-morning, the sun beat down ruthlessly, turning every exposed stone into a hot plate. They sought refuge beneath a slab of overhanging granite, where the air shimmered like molten glass. Leila wiped sweat from her brow and adjusted her scarf. Today, she said, pulling a cloth bundle from her pack, we study the tools. Tomas knelt eagerly as she unwrapped it. Inside lay replicas painstakingly crafted by her team. Copper chisels, gleaming softly, a bronze adze with a polished wooden handle, rough dolerite pounders, dark, heavy, merciless. Flat copper saws, wide as a man's palm, bow drills with braided sinew strings. Tomas frowned. This is it? These are the tools that shaped a civilization? Leila smiled. Yes, humble, but deadly in the right hands. She picked up a copper chisel. In the sunlight, it looked almost decorative. Soft metal, delicate shape, elegant design. Copper, she said, has a flaw. It's not hard enough for granite, not strong enough for diorite or quartzite. Yet these people built sarcophagi so perfect that even diamond-tipped tools today struggle to replicate them. Tomas ran his thumb along the copper's edge. But copper dulls so fast. It bends, it breaks. Exactly. So they sharpened constantly. Not once a day, Not once an hour. Constantly. She pointed to a small mound nearby, an overlooked cluster of pale fragments. Tomas picked one up and felt its rough texture. Sharpening stones, she said. Thousands of them have been found. The Egyptians spent as much time caring for their tools as using them. She handed him a dolerite pounder next. He leaned backward as the weight surprised him. Careful, she warned. They're deceptively heavy. It was shaped like a rounded egg, black as volcanic night, dense as iron. Tomas examined the surface. Smooth in some patches, pitted in others, worn from countless blows. Leila gestured toward the quarry floor. Imagine dozens of men standing shoulder to shoulder, each holding one of these, each striking the same spot, again and again. He winced. Their arms must have been carved from stone. Leila chuckled. Some ancient records say a master pounder could strike the rock 10,000 times a day. He stilled. 10,000? And that, she continued, was on a normal day. She walked toward a half-carved trench and motioned for Tomas to follow. There's something else about dolerite, she added. It doesn't shatter when it hits granite. It pulverizes the surface instead, like a natural jackhammer. Tomas swung the dolerite ball experimentally against a loose slab of granite. The impact rang through the air, sharp, metallic, brutal. Tiny flakes of granite scattered across the ground. He blinked. It works. It always worked. We just forgot.
Next, she picked up the copper saw. Unlike modern saws, it had no teeth, just a smooth, flat edge. Tomas tilted his head. How do you saw without teeth? You don't, Leila said. The sand does the cutting. She sprinkled a handful of quartz sand into a groove on the rock surface, poured a thin line of water over it, and handed Tomas the saw. Go on, she encouraged. He dragged the copper back and forth, slowly at first, then with more confidence. To his astonishment, a thin line began to appear, a groove growing deeper with every stroke. It's not the saw, Tomas murmured. It's the sand. Leila nodded. Quartz is harder than granite. Each grain becomes a mini blade. The copper only provides the rhythm. She watched him for a moment, savoring the realization forming on his face. She'd seen it dozens of times. Scientists who came expecting crude technology, only to discover subtle genius. You see, she said softly, we think of machines as the only path to precision, but the Egyptians had something better. What? He asked. Time. She lifted the bow drill next and tied a small cylinder of copper onto the tip. The drill, simple as a child's toy, looked incapable of anything important, but Leila pressed it against a granite block, pulled the bow once, and the drill tip spun rapidly. They used this to hollow stone, she explained. Once again, copper wasn't the blade. The sand inside the groove did the cutting. Tomas knelt beside her, fascinated now. So every tool was a collaboration. Copper, sand, water, and time. Yes, she said, 4 elements working together. He looked at the tools again. So primitive, so elegant. It's almost poetic. Leila stood, gazing across the quarry. That's the point. Their tools weren't just mechanical instruments. They were extensions of the craftsmen themselves. Every cut was an act of patience, every groove a line of devotion. She lifted a copper chisel to the sunlight. This wasn't a weakness. It was a philosophy. Tomas raised an eyebrow. Philosophy? She nodded. The Egyptians didn't fight the stone. They partnered with it. They listened to it, respected it, worked with its natural grain. Modern machines tear through stone. Ancient tools coaxed it. The wind blew a curtain of dust across the quarry, and for a moment, Leila imagined she could see them. Workers swaying in rhythmic motion, overseers directing with staffs, children carrying water jars, scribes documenting progress on clay tablets, the valley alive with purpose. Their tools, she whispered, weren't just objects. They were the bridge between human will and geologic time. Tomas turned, following her gaze. So the secret wasn't power, it was patience. Leila smiled, a slow, knowing smile. And mastery built over generations. They stood in silence as the desert hummed around them. The tools lay between them, simple, humble, deeply intelligent, the kind of intelligence no machine could replicate. The heat was already heavy when Leila and Tomas reached the deeper section of the quarry, where the stone walls rose like titans frozen mid-battle. The granite here was older, darker, veined with ribbons of quartz that sparkled under the sun. It was stone that looked alive, unyielding, proud, defiant. And yet, the ancient Egyptians had cut it with copper. Tomas stared at the block before them. This should be impossible. Leila smiled. That's why we're here. She placed her backpack down and withdrew a small wooden crate. Inside was a newly forged copper saw, flat, toothless, heavy enough to feel promising, but soft enough to bend if mishandled. Beside it lay bags of quartz sand, water skins, and wooden wedges. Today, she said, we recreate their technique. Tomas raised an eyebrow. We? As in me? Actually doing this? That's how you learn, Leila said. Not by reading, by sweating. She knelt beside the granite and instructed Tomas to pour a thin line of sand along a faint groove, one she had chosen with the precision of someone who had lived in the quarries long enough to see the invisible. He sprinkled the sand. Leila poured water over it. The mixture turned into a gritty paste that glittered softly. Now, she said, handing him the saw, start slowly. Let the sand do the work. Tomas positioned the saw against the groove and pulled. At first, nothing happened except a faint scraping. He frowned, tried again. The sound changed, sharper this time, more forceful. On the third pull, he felt resistance break. A tiny flake of granite came loose. He blinked. It's cutting. Leila nodded. It always cuts. The question is whether you can endure the rhythm. Tomas kept at it. Pull, push, pull. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Beads of sweat rolled down his forehead. His shoulders tightened. His breath grew heavy. And yet, even with the discomfort, a strange exhilaration crept into his movements. The groove deepened, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Leila crouched beside him. Do you know what archaeologists found in tombs? Copper saws up to 6 feet long. Imagine 50 men pulling a giant saw like this with quartz sand beneath it. That's insane, Tomas panted. Precisely, insane dedication. He paused only briefly, wiping sweat with his sleeve. But why go to such lengths? Wasn't there an easier way? No, Leila said, and that's the brilliance. She stood and pointed toward the distant edge of the quarry, where massive granite blocks once waited for transport. To them, stone wasn't just material, it was a spiritual medium. The harder the stone, the more worthy it was for the gods. Tomas resumed sawing, slower now, letting his breath find a pattern. After a few more minutes, he looked up. This isn't cutting, it's carving time itself. Leila smiled. Now you understand. She handed him a bow drill next. Your turn to try hollowing.
Tomas groaned, But curiosity won. He sprinkled sand into a shallow pit in the granite, added water, positioned the copper cylinder, and pulled the bow back and forth. The drill spun rapidly, its circular motion grinding quartz into the granite. Tiny grains shimmered like stars beneath the copper tip. "It's weirdly satisfying," he admitted. That's why they kept doing it. Thousands of men, generations of experts, each inheriting the muscle memory of the ones before. She gestured toward the granite walls where neat rows of circular pits lined the stone like constellations. "Those marks," she whispered, "are fingerprints of people who never saw themselves as extraordinary, but they were." She knelt beside a fissure in the rock, running her hand across it gently. "Do you know what Egyptians did after creating a shallow groove with saws? They inserted wooden wedges along the cut. Then, she lifted a water skin and poured water over a wedge tucked into a narrow crack. The wood swelled slowly. Then suddenly, crack! The granite snapped apart along the weakened line. Tomas jumped. That sounded like thunder. Leila laughed. Yes, they could split tons of stone with nothing but wood and patience. He stared at the fractured stone, admiration replacing exhaustion. It's so simple. It's simple because they spent centuries perfecting it. Simplicity at the end of mastery is genius. She walked toward another block of granite, one left half-cut by ancient workers. The cut was extraordinarily straight, clean as a geometric drawing. "Look here," she said. "This groove has perfectly parallel sides. That's not easy to achieve even with modern saws." Tomas leaned in. "How?" Leila placed her hand over the groove by keeping the sand layer uniform, by measuring constantly, by listening to the rhythm of the cut. She pointed to a faint, almost invisible line along the block. They used pigments to mark guidelines. They used shadow and sunlight to check angles. Their precision wasn't an accident. It was a ritual. Tomas gazed at her, dust covering his hair and face. They were craftsmen, artists, scientists, engineers. All of that, Leila agreed. And something more. Patient beyond imagination. The sun dipped slightly, casting long shadows across the granite surfaces. The air felt charged with memory. Tomas placed the saw down and stood, stretching his stiff shoulders. "You know," he said quietly, "we always imagine ancient workers as suffering under forced labor. But this feels like devotion." Leila nodded. Cutting stone was sacred. It was how they touched eternity. Birds circled overhead, their shadows flickering across the granite surfaces like dancing spirits. The desert wind shifted, carrying a faint echo, like distant hammering, faint, rhythmic, eternal. Tomas glanced up sharply. "Do you hear that?" Leila's expression softened. "Yes. This valley remembers." They stood side by side as the sound faded into the heat. The groove Tomas had carved glowed in the sunlight, a fresh wound on ancient flesh. A reminder that the technique worked, that the past was not dead, only sleeping. Leila picked up the copper saw one last time, turning it in her hands. "Copper against granite shouldn't work," she said softly. "And yet it does. Because the Egyptians didn't cut stone with force." She paused, letting the desert breathe around her. They cut stone with understanding.
By the time the sun began to fall behind the granite ridges, the quarry had shifted in Leila's imagination. It was no longer a field of dead stone.
It was a stage that had once been filled with movement, with noise, with life. The more she walked its broken paths, the clearer the picture became in her mind, an invisible film rewinding through 4,500 years. That night, as the camp lanterns flickered and a chorus of insects hummed beyond the tents, Leila lay awake, listening to the whisper of wind against canvas. It sounded, faintly, like something else, like the distant echo of tools hitting stone. She closed her eyes and let the sound carry her. The modern tent walls melted away. The air grew denser, warmer. When she opened her eyes again, in her mind's eye, she was standing not in the present, but in the old kingdom. The quarry was alive. Dust hung in the air like a second sky, glowing gold in the morning light. The smell of sweat, granite powder, and wet rope filled her lungs. Hundreds of men moved across the valley, some carrying water jars, others dragging sleds. Many clustered in teams around chosen blocks of stone. The noise was startling at first, a thunder of rhythmic pounding, voices shouting, the scrape of stone on stone. But as she listened more closely, she heard something else beneath the chaos. A pattern. On a high ledge, an overseer stood with a staff in his hand, his deep voice cutting through the noise like a drumbeat. Ha! 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 With every shout, a wave of hammer blows crashed against the granite walls, dolerite pounders smashing in unison. Dozens of men swinging heavy stones in the same cadence, their muscles moving like the pistons of a great living engine. Leila watched as one group worked on freeing a rectangular block. They formed a line, feet planted, torsos swaying, each man knowing exactly when his turn to strike would come. Ha! 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 The blows landed like a heartbeat. A younger worker, barely more than a boy, missed the rhythm, striking too late. His hammer hit with a weak, off-tempo tap that produced a sharp, unpleasant ring. The overseer's gaze snapped toward him. Again, he barked. The boy, eyes wide, reset his grip, watching the men around him. Sweat dripped from his brow, stung his eyes. He inhaled, exhaled, waited. Ha! 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 This time his hammer landed in perfect unison with the others. The sound deepened, warmed, became music. The overseer nodded once and turned away. Leila saw it clearly. This wasn't random labor. This was orchestrated, a choreography of exhaustion and precision. The overseer wasn't just a supervisor, he was a conductor. Nearby, a group of men dragged a sled loaded with a half-cut block along a grooved path. Their bare feet dug into the dust, ropes bit into their calloused hands. At the front, a man with a shaved head and a narrow beard shouted a chant that rose and fell with their steps. Heave! 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 With each word, they leaned forward, muscles bulging, bodies straining. Along the path, other workers rushed ahead with jars, splashing water over the stone track, turning dust into a slippery slurry. The sled slid forward more easily each time, leaving wet streaks behind it. The water boys laughed as they ran, but this too was calculated. The Egyptians had long ago learned that slick, wet sand could reduce friction dramatically. Modern physics would one day confirm it. They already knew it by instinct. Heave! 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 The chant turned effort into rhythm. The rhythm turned chaos into control. On another ledge, Leila saw a small group sitting cross-legged around a slab of limestone, their hands moving quickly as they carved tiny incisions. At first, she thought they were laborers resting. Then she realized they were sharpening tools. Copper chisels lay in a neat row before them. One man dipped a chisel into oil, Another pressed it against a rough sharpening stone, dragging it back and forth in smooth, practiced motions. Sparks briefly leapt in the hot air. A younger man blew dust off finished chisels, placing them into a basket with reverence. There was nothing careless here, nothing wasted. Every motion was part of a greater cycle. Strike, dull, sharpen, strike again. Like breath, like the beating of a heart.
At the edge of the quarry, shaded beneath a canvas awning, sat a scribe. He wore a simple linen kilt and held a wooden board on his knees. With a reed pen dipped in ink, he marked tallies into columns. Team 3, trench width, 8 cubits, an overseer reported. The scribe nodded, marking a neat line. Workers assigned: 40 men, 2 tool boys, 1 water boy. More lines, more symbols. It looked like math. It looked like poetry. It was both. Leila realized then that the rhythm of labor wasn't just physical. It was administrative. Every blow of the hammer, every drag of the sled, every chisel strike had been anticipated, recorded, planned. This was not a mob of workers. It was an organized machine, powered not by steam or electricity, but by food, discipline, belief, and relentless repetition. She found herself drifting toward a cluster of particularly focused workers standing in a tight circle. In the center, a master mason knelt by a block of granite. His arms were corded with muscle, his hands scarred from decades of work. A copper chisel rested in his left palm, a wooden mallet in his right. The block before him already bore a near-perfect edge. The line was straight, sharp, impossibly clean. The master mason inhaled slowly, exhaled, and then tap. He didn't strike with brute force. The blow was small, measured, precise. The chisel kissed the stone. Tap, tap, tap. Each strike was followed by a pause, the man listening, not with his ears, but with his bones. He moved the chisel a finger's width. Tap, tap, tap. To him, this wasn't labor. It was communication. Leila watched mesmerized. Without a ruler, without a laser level, without a digital gauge, he was achieving a level of precision that modern construction teams sometimes missed with all those tools. Behind him, 2 apprentices stood ready with a length of knotted cord. When the master finally stood, they stretched the cord along the edge he had carved. Knots aligned with the corners, measuring perfect cubit lengths. One apprentice squinted at the shadows cast by the sun, nodding. "It is true," he said respectfully. "The edge is straight." The master merely grunted, already turning to the next side. There was no celebration, no applause. Perfection in this place was not a miracle. It was the expected rhythm. Leila's heart swelled. The picture was complete now. Dolerite pounders striking in unison on command, sled teams chanting their way across wet sand, sharpeners humming as they honed edge after edge, scribes recording every unit of effort, master masons coaxing perfection from unyielding stone. The entire quarry was a living machine, one that thought in cubits and chance instead of gears and wires. Then, as quickly as it had come, the vision faded. Leila was back in her tent, the lantern flickering low. Tomas snored softly in the tent next door. The modern night pressed around them, quieter, emptier. But the rhythm stayed with her. She sat up, grabbed her notebook, and began to write. They were the machines, each man a piston,
each chant a gear. They didn't need steel because they had something stronger: coordination. She paused, pen hovering above the paper. In her mind, she heard once more the overseer's cry, the syncopated blows of hammer on stone, the rasp of a sled over wet sand. Humanity, she realized, had built its first great wonders not in spite of their limits, but because of them. They had no motors, so they created muscle orchestras. They had no algorithms, so they made mathematics of shadows and braids. They did not possess machines. They became them. Outside, the desert breathed. Somewhere beyond the black horizon, the quarries slept under the same stars as those ancient workers. The stones remembered. The earth remembered. And now, slowly, she was remembering too.
The next morning, the desert woke slowly, first with a faint blush in the sky, then with a thin ribbon of gold appearing over the granite cliffs, then finally with the full glare of the sun reclaiming its kingdom. But Leila was already awake, sitting cross-legged atop a large granite boulder, staring at the horizon as though it were a page she was meant to read. Numbers danced in her mind, lines, angles, slopes. The Egyptians had been master stonecutters, but they had been something even more powerful, geometers. Tomas approached quietly, holding 2 cups of tea. "You're thinking again," he said. "I never stop," Leila murmured, accepting the cup. He sat beside her and followed her gaze. "Let me guess. You've moved on from tools to math." Leila smiled faintly. "Not just math, sacred math." She pointed toward the distant edge of the quarry, where the Nile could be seen glittering. Those pyramids weren't placed at random. Their cuts weren't shaped by guesswork. Every stone, every inch was measured with principles so precise that they bordered on spiritual. Tomas sipped his tea. "You think geometry was part of their religion?" "I think," she said slowly, "it was their religion." She stood, brushing granite dust off her trousers, and motioned for Tomas to follow. They walked toward a shaded tent where Leila kept her study materials, photographs, diagrams, old scroll reproductions, and a few treasured tools. She picked up a measuring cord, woven from flax, knotted at specific intervals. This, she said, holding it reverently, was their calculator. Tomas squinted. "A rope?" "A rope with fixed ratios," she corrected. "The famous knotted grid. With it, they built right angles, measured distances, drew perfect rectangles. Not because they had machines, but because they had proportions." She laid the cord on the sand, forming a triangle with sides of 3, 4, and 5 knots. Tomas blinked. "That's the Pythagorean triangle." "Centuries before Pythagoras," Leila said. "The Egyptians used this for foundations, for cuts, for alignments. They didn't form right angles by sight, they formed them by design." She drew a square in the sand using the cord. The lines were remarkably straight, even for such a simple demonstration. "This," she said, "is how they made sure every block face was true." Tomas knelt beside the drawing, tracing it with his finger. So geometry wasn't separate from stone cutting, it was fused into it. "Exactly," Leila said. "They didn't carve blindly. Every cut followed an invisible blueprint." She stood again, pointing to the sun. "And then there was light." Tomas turned to her. "Light?" "Light," she repeated, "their greatest measuring tool." She led him to a tall, weathered pillar of granite, half buried in sand. At its base, a thin shadow stretched across the ground. "This isn't just a broken column," she said. "It was a gnomon, a shadow pole. They used these to track solstices, to mark cardinal directions, to check the angles of their cuts with incredible precision. She placed a straight rod on the ground. When the shadow aligns with this line, the cut is perfect. If it's even a fraction off, the shadow reveals the flaw. Tomas stared. Shadow leveling, that's brilliant. And free, added Leila with a grin. She walked a few paces farther and pointed to a series of faint grooves etched into a granite block. What do you see? Tomas leaned closer. Lines, straight, parallel, evenly spaced. Measuring lines, she said. These were guides for cutting teams. The grooves marked exactly where to apply force, how far to cut, and how deep to go. A single misalignment could ruin an entire block. She rested her palm against the stone. These lines were like prayers, quiet, precise, repeated daily. Then her tone shifted, softer, deeper. But it wasn't just about straight edges or flawless symmetry. Their geometry had meaning. The pyramids weren't perfect for perfection's sake. They embodied cosmic order. She picked up a stick and drew a wide triangle in the sand. The slope of the Great Pyramid, 51.84 degrees, perfectly encodes the ratio of the circle. The perimeter of the base of the pyramid equals the circumference of a circle with the radius equal to its height. Tomas blinked. But that means they knew pi. Maybe not as a number, but as an idea. They understood harmony, balance, the relationship between earth and sky. She drew lines radiating from the pyramid shape. Everything they built reflected the universe. Even their stone cuts followed proportions that mirrored natural growth patterns, ratios we now call the golden proportion. Tomas shook his head in awe. I always imagined them as builders, but you're making them sound like philosophers. They were all of that, Leila said. Masons, priests, astronomers, mathematicians. They didn't divide these roles. Creation was unity. She paused, letting the silence settle around them. Then she whispered. They cut stone the way a priest chants hymns, repeating sacred patterns.
Tomas considered this quietly before speaking again. So every granite block from Aswan, every limestone casing stone, every sarcophagus was shaped not just with tools, but with formulas. And with purpose, Leila said. Geometry wasn't just a science, it was a language. She lifted her hand toward the distant desert. And the pyramids are a sentence written in stone. They walked farther into the quarry until they reached a cliff where the sun cast long, sharp shadows across the granite floor. Leila stopped. This, she said, was once a measuring courtyard. They used the movement of shadows to judge the flatness of a polished stone surface. She picked up a long bronze rod and held it horizontally above a smooth slab. The shadow beneath it formed a perfect line. If the shadow wavered, that meant the surface wasn't level, she explained. No modern machine, just sun, stone, and mind. Tomas crouched, running his hand along the surface. It felt impossibly smooth, as if someone had spent days polishing it with intention bordering on obsession. He looked up. So that's their secret. Geometry in sunlight. Leila shook her head gently. It's part of the secret, but the real magic isn't the tools or the formulas. She tapped her temple. It's the thinking, the vision, the discipline. She pointed back toward the pyramid shape she had drawn earlier. Most civilizations built shelters. Egypt built ideas. Tomas nodded slowly, understanding now that the Egyptians didn't just cut stone, they shaped meaning. As they stepped away from the cliff, the afternoon light cast a wide golden glow across the quarry, as though blessing the ruins with an ancient memory. Leila looked over her shoulder at the lines she had drawn in the sand. Lines that echoed the past, lines that whispered their own quiet truth. Precision begins not in the hand, but in the mind. The wind swept through the quarry like a low ancient sigh, carrying with it the scent of dust and memory. The evening sun turned the granite walls into sheets of molten amber. It was at this hour, when heat softened, when shadows stretched long, that Leila felt the past come nearest. She stood at the base of a tall cliff where hundreds of circular pits pocked the stone, dolerite pound marks, the fingerprints of forgotten workers. She closed her eyes. The air hummed. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. Tomas looked around. "Hear what?" Leila knelt and pressed her ear to the granite surface. Her fingers traced faint indentations. The stone radiated the warmth of the day, steady and deep. "Stone speaks," she said, "if you know how to listen." Tomas crouched beside her, placing his palm gently against the wall. It felt solid, cold now that the sun was fading. "It's not speaking to me," he admitted with a half-smile. "It will," she said softly, "but not in words." She stood up and brushed dust off her knees. "Come with me." They walked toward a small enclave of the quarry, known to archaeologists as the resonance chamber, a place where ancient workers had shaped sarcophagus lids and temple blocks. The chamber was naturally formed, but the Egyptians had altered it. The walls bore signs of smoothing, intentional carving, and chisel marks. When they stepped inside, the air felt cooler, still, heavy. The moment Tomas entered, he stopped. Do you feel that?" he asked. Leila nodded. "This place holds sound. The ancient masons knew its acoustic secrets." She lifted a small dolerite ball and struck it lightly against a slab of granite. The sound that erupted was not a simple tap. It rang like a bell, deep, vibrating, resonant. It lingered long after the stone stopped moving. Tomas inhaled sharply. "That's beautiful." "And useful," Leila said. She handed him the dolerite ball. "Strike softly. Listen." He obeyed. Tap. The note that hummed through the chamber was different now, higher, thinner. Leila walked toward him. Different parts of the stone vibrate differently based on density. A trained quarry master could tell whether a block was flawed or perfect just from sound. She struck another slab. A dull thud. "That block," she explained, "has a hidden crack. If they tried to carve it for a royal tomb, it would fail halfway through. They didn't waste time or labor. They listened." Tomas looked at his dolerite stone as if seeing it for the first time. So sound was one of their tools. "It was the tool," Leila said. "Long before lasers and ultrasound scanners, the Egyptians used acoustics. They felt vibration through their hands, their feet, their bones." She placed her hand flat against the rock face. A master mason could sense where the stone wanted to break. She spread Tomas's fingers across a block and tapped the surface lightly beside his palm. The vibration tingled under his skin. "Oh, I felt that," Tomas whispered. "Exactly," Leila said. "That's how they guided their cuts. They weren't forcing stone apart. They were following natural fault lines, revealed through sound." She stepped back, motioning toward the room. "Imagine it. Hundreds of workers, each with a dolerite ball, each listening, each adjusting, each learning the song of the stone."
A gust of evening wind slipped into the chamber, carrying a faint rumble from the desert outside. Leila's voice softened. "The Egyptians believed stone had a soul," she said, "and they believed sound could awaken it." Tomas smiled gently. That's poetic. Leila chuckled. All ancient science was poetic. They walked deeper into the chamber, where the walls narrowed and the sound grew sharper. Leila stopped at a spot where a long, shallow groove had been carved by ancient hands. "These grooves," she said, "are where they tested sound. They struck here, and the echoes gave them information about thickness and weak points." She took out a copper chisel and set it lightly against the groove. "Try tapping this." Tomas gave the chisel a hesitant tap. The sound echoed like a tight drum. "Now move an inch to the right," Leila instructed. He tapped again. The pitch dropped. "See?" she said. "The stone is telling you where its density changes." Tomas stared at the groove in awe. So this entire quarry was like a musical workshop. Leila laughed softly. "Yes, a symphony of stone." They left the chamber and climbed a ridge overlooking the entire quarry. The sun had dipped low now, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the massive landscape. "Listen," Leila said again. At first Tomas heard only the wind, but then, beneath it, faint and strange, a low rhythmic thumping. He straightened. "What is that?" Leila smiled knowingly. "It's the workers at the modern quarry a few kilometers away. Same rhythm, same tools, same stone." She nodded toward the distant sound. Modern cutters using steel still fall into the ancient rhythm because stone doesn't change. The body doesn't change. Her voice grew quieter. Only memory fades. They sat together on the ridge, the world around them turning bronze in the dying light. "The Egyptians," Leila continued, "didn't carve with brute strength alone. They carved with senses modern workers forgot to use." She touched her ear, her hand, her chest. They listened. They felt. They harmonized. Tomas leaned back on his elbows. It's almost like they were whispering with the stone. Leila nodded, and the stone whispered back. Below them, the last rays of sunlight glimmered across the granite, making each block glow as though illuminated from within. The wind carried the faint resonance of distant hammering, old echoes entwined with new. Stone had a memory. Stone had a voice, and the Egyptians knew its language. Leila breathed deeply, her eyes shining. "In the end," she said, "they didn't conquer stone. They conversed with it." Dawn broke gently over the quarry, casting pale ribbons of light across the granite walls. The desert was quiet, too quiet, like a great beast holding its breath. But Leila felt a pulse beneath it, an ancient rhythm beating through the stone. Today's lesson, she knew, was the softest of all. Not force, not geometry, not sound, but the three oldest tools in human history: water, sand, and time. She gathered her notes and found Tomas already awake, sitting cross-legged near a shallow pit filled with yesterday's experiments. The copper saw lay beside him, still dusted with quartz. He traced the groove they had carved, his brow furrowed. "This groove," he said softly, "it's deeper than I expected, and straighter." Leila smiled. "Water makes everything obedient, even stone." He shot her a puzzled look, but she only gestured for him to follow her. They walked toward the northern ridge of the quarry, where a strange sight awaited them. A smooth, bowl-shaped depression carved into the granite floor. It looked like nature's handiwork, but Leila knew better. "These," she kneeled beside the basin, "are erosion wells."
Ancient workers poured water into natural fissures to soften the stone. Not soften in the literal sense, she corrected herself, noticing Tomas's raised eyebrow, but soften the behavior of the stone. Tomas ran his hand across the depression. Water did this. Partly, Leila said, and sand. Always sand. She took a handful of granulated quartz from a nearby pouch and let it slip through her fingers. The grains glittered like tiny stars. To the Egyptians, sand wasn't dirt. It was a blade, every grain as sharp as a microscopic knife. She pointed to the basin. Imagine a crew filling this with water, pouring sand into the cracks, stirring it like a cauldron. Then another team pounding with dolerite. The water would carry the sand deeper, the sand would carve, the dolerite would grind. She looked at Tomas. It's slow, painfully slow, but time was their ally.
They walked farther into the quarry, where shallow trenches snaked like veins across the bedrock. Some trenches were long and straight, others curved elegantly, like the strokes of a calligrapher's brush. These channels, Leila explained, were carved with a mix of sand and water pushed back and forth by wooden paddles, over days, weeks, sometimes months. Tomas knelt beside a trench, scooping up a bit of sand. So they didn't cut stone, they eroded it. Exactly, Leila said, her eyes gleaming. They mimicked nature. The Nile carved canyons, wind carved cliffs, water carved caves. The Egyptians copied these processes, just faster, more focused, with intention.
She sat beside him, drawing a circle in the sand with her finger. Think of water as the persuader, sand as the persuader's whisper. Together they wore down granite like patient gods. A breeze lifted her hair as she continued. And time was their greatest luxury. They weren't in a hurry. A king's monument could take decades. Tomas gazed across the sprawling quarry. It must have taken unimaginable patience. Yes, Leila said, because stone is not conquered, it is courted. They moved on, descending into a lower excavation area where water still pooled in ancient cracks, remnants from the previous night's desert dew. Here Leila knelt again and placed her hand over a faint series of parallel lines in the granite. These are abrasion lines, she said, created when teams used ropes covered in wet sand. They pulled the ropes back and forth, like sawing with silk. She mimed the motion, slow and graceful. 100 men pulling, 100 resting, rotating shifts, hours becoming days, days becoming weeks, until the stone surrendered its shape. Tomas stared in wonder. So even when they sawed stone, they weren't actually sawing, they were sanding. Leila nodded proudly. Yes, that's the secret no one expects. The Egyptians didn't defeat granite, they wore it down grain by grain. As they walked deeper into the quarry, the sun rose higher, illuminating patches of ground that shimmered faintly. Tomas noticed it and squinted. What's that shine? Crushed quartz, Leila said. Leftovers from ancient polishing. Come, look closely. They crouched beside the shimmering patch and brushed it lightly. Beneath the dust lay a stone that was smoother than glass. Leila used her sleeve to wipe it clean. The surface reflected their faces. This, she whispered, was polished with powdered quartz and water. They made mirrors out of stone. Sarcophagi,
polished so perfectly that modern diamond tools struggle to replicate the sheen. Tomas touched the polished surface carefully. It's flawless. It took months, constant rubbing, water to keep dust down, quartz to carve microscopic layers, time to finish the rest. She let her fingers glide across the stone. Imagine a team of workers sitting here, dawn to dusk, singing as they rubbed the stone in circles, their voices echoing off the cliffs, their hands moving until they were numb. Tomas leaned back, letting the picture form. Sand for cutting, water for guiding, time for perfecting. Yes, Leila said softly. That was their sacred triad. She stood and looked around the quarry as if seeing into another century. Water revealed the stone's secrets, she continued. It softened dust, exposed weaknesses, cooled the tools, quieted the fractures. It showed them where to push and where to wait. She turned to Tomas. And sand? Sand was the invisible edge of every tool. The wind picked up, sending waves across the quarry floor. Sand danced in the air, swirling around them like golden smoke. Leila lifted a handful and let it scatter. This, she said, is what shaped temples. They walked toward the riverbank where ancient workers once floated massive blocks onto wooden barges. The Nile glistened peacefully, but Leila knew it had once been the engine of everything. The Nile gave them time. Floods gave them seasons. Seasons gave them predictability. Predictability gave them patience. They stood in silence, listening to the water lap against the shore. Tomas finally spoke. Machines can be fast, but they can't be patient. Leila smiled softly. Exactly. The Egyptians didn't need metal because they had time. She stepped closer to the water and whispered, Water cuts mountains. Sand reshapes worlds. And time honors the patient. Tomas stared at her, realizing the deeper truth. Machines cut stone, he said, but the Egyptians, they listened to it. Leila nodded, her eyes reflecting the shimmer of the Nile. That, she said, is how they achieved perfection. The river flowed on, eternal, ancient, whispering a secret as old as civilization itself.
Night fell over the Giza Plateau like a velvet curtain. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of desert grass and the echo of distant city lights. But beneath the stars, the silhouettes of the pyramids and the Sphinx stood timeless, dark giants guarding the threshold of history. Leila and Tomas arrived just before midnight. Their special permit gave them access few received, a chance to examine the hidden cavities around the Sphinx when tourists were far away and the desert was still. As they approached, the Sphinx emerged from the shadows, half lion, half man, all mystery. Its massive paws reached forward like the arms of a sleeping titan, its face weathered yet unyielding, staring eternally across the sands. Tomas whispered, "Every time I see it, I feel small." Leila smiled softly. "That is the point." But tonight, they weren't here to admire. They were here to investigate. They walked into the fenced-off excavation pit surrounding the Sphinx. The ground dipped sharply, revealing walls of limestone deeply scarred by ancient and modern work alike. Harsh lights mounted on poles cast long shadows over carved stone ledges, tunnels, and deep fissures.
Leila knelt beside a rectangular shaft dug decades earlier, a place archaeologists called the Mason's Trench. "Look there," she whispered. Tomas knelt beside her. His flashlight beam revealed the unmistakable marks carved into the limestone wall. Parallel grooves, even spacing, consistent depth. "Cutting lines," Tomas said, "just like at Aswan." "Exactly," Leila replied. "These are unfinished cuts left by ancient workers, a snapshot frozen in time." She ran her fingers along the grooves. They were not rough, not crude, they were nearly perfect. This trench tells us the Sphinx wasn't carved with chaos, it was carved with method, with planning, with order. She leaned closer, pointing to faint circular depressions scattered along the groove's path. "See those?" Tomas nodded. "Drill holes. Yes, bow drill holes, just like the ones we studied at Aswan. This is proof that the same techniques used at Aswan were used here." She turned to look up at the Sphinx's massive body. The body was carved straight from the living rock, a single colossal block of limestone. Tomas exhaled slowly. "It must have taken years," Leila nodded. "Years of chiseling, sawing, drilling, and listening." She stood and led him along the pathway toward another excavation area. Here the limestone walls were smoother, polished by ancient tools and softened by centuries of wind erosion. "This," she said, "is where this story gets interesting." She pointed to a narrow tunnel partially collapsed and sealed by modern authorities. Beneath the Sphinx are cavities, some natural, some deliberately carved. "Chambers?" Tomas asked. "Yes, and the marks inside tell the same story. Stone shaped with patience, geometry, and acoustics." They crouched beside a shallow recess in the limestone. The flashlight beam illuminated more grooves and chisel marks, some deep, some shallow, all meticulously aligned. "I always thought the Sphinx was carved first and cleaned up later," Tomas said. "No. Look closely. These are not cleanup marks. These are guide cuts." She traced a faint chalk line still visible despite its age. They marked everything: angles, depths, alignment paths. They left chalk lines, pigment streaks, measurement points. She leaned back, smiling. They weren't guessing, they were calculating. A gust of wind stirred the sand, but beneath the noise, Tomas heard something else. A low, rhythmic vibration, like distant humming. "What is that sound?" Tomas asked. Leila's expression grew thoughtful. "Come." She led him toward a niche carved in the limestone wall behind the Sphinx's shoulder. They stepped inside the small alcove. The air grew cooler, damper. "Stand here," she said softly. Tomas obeyed. She gently pressed his palm against the wall. At first, nothing. Then, a tremor. Subtle, like the purring of a giant sleeping beneath the earth. "That," Leila said, "is natural resonance. The Sphinx sits at a geological intersection where certain frequencies travel differently. The ancient masons noticed it." She tapped lightly on the wall with her knuckles. The stones sang, a faint, deep tone that vibrated through their bones. "Just like the resonance chamber at Aswan," Tomas whispered. "Yes. Here, the masons used natural resonance to guide carving. They could tell if an area was solid or unstable. They avoided weak rock, they emphasized strong layers. That's why the Sphinx still stands after thousands of years."
The moon rose above the horizon, casting a silver glow across the plateau. The Sphinx's eyes shimmered faintly, as though awakened by the night. Leila exhaled. "The secrets aren't beneath the Sphinx," she said. "They're written all over it." The sun was merciless the next morning, turning the desert horizon into a wavering mirage. Yet Leila felt more energized than she had in days. Today was the day theory would meet reality, not in ancient quarries, but in the hands of modern people attempting to do what the Egyptians did with effortless mastery. The experiment site was set up on a large flat patch of granite near the Aswan quarry's southern end. A small crowd had already gathered: archaeologists, engineers, geologists, and a few visiting students eager enough to volunteer for back-breaking work. Tomas stood at the center of the group, adjusting his gloves. "This is madness," he muttered under his breath. "Good madness," Leila corrected with a smile. She addressed the group. "Today we recreate ancient techniques, not with machines, not with shortcuts, only with what the Egyptians had: copper, sand, water, and muscle." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some looked excited, others looked nervous, a few looked like they regretted signing up. Tomas leaned close and whispered, "You know they're expecting to fail, right?" "Of course," Leila said, "but that's how they'll learn." She clapped her hands, signaling everyone to gather around a large granite block set on wooden supports. The block was rough, uneven, untouched, just as ancient stone would have been before its transformation. "First trial," she announced. "Copper chisels versus granite." She passed out copper chisels and wooden mallets. The modern volunteers weighed them in their hands, surprised by the softness of the metal. A young engineering student raised his hand. "But this won't work, right? Copper is too soft." Leila smiled knowingly. "Strike and see." The first few blows rang out across the quarry. Dull, unimpressive. The copper edges flattened instantly, bending like warm clay. A few people laughed nervously. "Copper is useless," someone said. Leila stepped forward. "Copper alone, yes, but copper with intention." She motioned to Tomas. He picked up a chisel, sharpened it with a stone, quick, confident strokes, then positioned it precisely along the granite's natural grain. He inhaled, exhaled, and struck. Tap, 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 tap. The sound resonated differently. Lower, warmer. The stone responded. A tiny shard broke free. The group fell silent. Tomas repeated the taps, measured, rhythmic, controlled. The groove deepened, slowly, painfully, undeniably. Leila turned to the group. Ancient workers weren't swinging wildly. They understood stone. They followed fault lines. They listened for the right pitch. A geologist stepped forward, fascinated now. So it was technique, not force. Technique, Leila agreed, and infinite patience. She moved to the next station.
They moved back outside, climbing onto a narrow platform where the Sphinx's flank glowed in the artificial lights. Its ancient contours were carved with precision, sweeping lines, flat planes, curved profiles. Tomas shook his head in disbelief. This is limestone, soft, but carving something this size with copper tools, it must have been extremely delicate. Yes, Leila replied. Limestone is soft, but inconsistent. Some layers crumble, others resist. If you strike too hard, you chip away more than intended. Too soft, and nothing happens. She pointed to a faintly polished section near the Sphinx's back. Look at that! Smoother than glass in places. That's not erosion. That's polishing. Thousands of strokes with stone, sand, and water. A silence settled over them. Then Tomas spoke, his voice quiet. "It feels intimate, like the workers left their hands here." "They did," Leila whispered. She walked toward the Sphinx's paw, enormous and awe-inspiring. A plateau nearby held more unfinished work, blocks partially carved, trenches partially cut. As if the workers had been called away suddenly, leaving clues frozen in place. Leila crouched beside one such block. It bore 2 perfect parallel cuts on adjacent sides. "This," she said, "is the clearest evidence we have." She handed Tomas her flashlight. "Shine it along the grooves." He did. The light revealed straight lines, so straight they looked machine-cut. Tomas swallowed. How were they this precise? "By mastering everything," Leila said. "Tools, geometry, sound, water, sand, time, and something more." She placed a hand over her chest. "Intuition." The desert wind rose again, stirring the sand into soft spirals. Shadows danced across the Sphinx's ancient body, giving it the illusion of movement, breath, life. "Look at it," Leila whispered. Thousands of workers, decades of labor, millions of cuts, every inch shaped by human hands. Tomas stared in awe. "They shaped the earth like sculptors shape clay." Leila nodded. "They sculpted the impossible."
Second trial, the copper saw and sand. A wide copper blade lay across a granite slab. Buckets of quartz sand sat nearby, sparkling like crushed diamonds. Leila motioned to 2 volunteers. "Pour the sand." They poured a thick line of quartz into the saw groove. Others followed with water. The mixture thickened into a gritty slurry. "Now," she said, "pull." 4 volunteers grabbed the ends of the saw and began to drag it back and forth. At first, they struggled to find a rhythm. The saw stuck. Someone lost their grip. Sand flew. But slowly, the groove appeared. Is it actually cutting?" one of them asked, incredulous. "No," Leila said. "The sand is cutting. The saw is guiding." She crouched beside the groove, running her finger along the wet granite. This is exactly how Egyptians cut sarcophagi lids, temple blocks, obelisks. The volunteers continued pulling. 15 minutes later, they had a straight, deep cut that looked shockingly precise. An older engineer stared at the groove as if questioning his entire career. "This shouldn't be possible." Leila smiled. Human genius is often underestimated. "Third trial," Tomas called out, lifting a wooden bow drill. The volunteers gathered around. The drill, so primitive it looked like a child's toy, caused several skeptical eyebrows to rise. Tomas positioned the copper drill bit against the granite. "Prepare the sand." A student poured sand into the shallow pit. "Now add water." Another volunteer poured. Tomas pulled the bow. The drill spun rapidly, churning sand into the granite surface. Dust mixed with slurry. The drill sank deeper. "Switch," Tomas shouted. A new volunteer took over, then another, then another. Each one applied pressure differently, each one discovering how subtle the tool was. After 30 minutes, a perfectly round drill hole sat before them, smooth-sided, clean, flawless. Someone whispered, This looks like machine work." Leila stepped forward. "Exactly. That's why modern people can't believe these were made without metal tools. But the Egyptians weren't using the drill bit to cut. They were using the sand as a circular blade."
They moved to the fourth station, the wooden wedges. A deep groove had been pre-made using saw and chisel. Now several thick wooden wedges sat ready beside a water jar. "Place the wedges," Leila instructed. Volunteers hammered the wedges gently into the groove until they were firmly seated. "Now pour," she said. Water soaked into the wood. A tense silence settled over the group. At first, nothing happened. Then, crack! The granite split cleanly along the groove, as if obeying an ancient command. The crowd gasped, stepping back instinctively. A professor whispered, This is elegant." Leila nodded. Stone splitting wasn't brute force. It was controlled swelling. The Egyptians had a profound understanding of natural materials. The experiments continued for hours. The volunteers sweated, laughed, failed, tried again. Their early frustration turned into fascination, and eventually into respect. By late afternoon, the group had accomplished what most believed impossible. They had cut, shaped, polished, and split granite using nothing but ancient tools. As they gathered for water and shade, Thomas wiped dust from his face. "Look at them," he whispered to Leila. "They're stunned." "They should be," she replied. The Egyptians were not magicians. They were masters. One of the engineers approached them, shaking his head. "I teach mechanical engineering. My students design hydraulic saws and diamond drills. But today, I learned more about cutting stone than in my entire career." Leila's expression softened. "Because today, you didn't use machines. You used your mind, your senses, your hands." He nodded slowly. "Now I understand." As the experiment site quieted and the sun dipped towards the cliffs, Leila gazed across the quarry. Fresh grooves and drill holes sat beside ancient ones, the work of two far-separated generations now sharing the same stone. "It wasn't magic," she whispered. "It was mastery." Thomas stepped beside her. "Do you think we honored them today?" Leila looked down at the granite beneath her feet, scarred, shaped, enduring. "I hope so," she said, "because we finally saw the world through their eyes."
By the time Leila and Tomas reached the base of the Giza Plateau again, the sun was sinking low, smearing orange and crimson across the sky like pigments on a royal palette. The wind was gentle. The desert felt quieter here, more solemn, more observant. Yet beneath its silence lived the echoes of another age, an age of scribes, overseers, architects, and engineers who had birthed wonders in the name of a king. As they climbed toward the old workers' cemetery, Leila paused. The place didn't look like the slave pits of legend. Instead, it was calm, rows of simple square tombs built with care. Many bore hieroglyphic inscriptions, names, titles, ranks. Thomas read them aloud, quietly. Inspector of Quarrymen, Chief Draftsman of the West, Overseer of the Stone Yard, Master of Measurements. He looked up at Leila. "They recorded every role." "Of course," Leila replied. "These were not slaves. These were royal workers, paid, trained, honored." She led him toward a low stone wall overlooking the pyramids. "Do you know how many people it took to build an entire pyramid complex?" Thomas took a guess. 100,000? No, Leila shook her head. 30 to 40,000 workers, more during peak seasons, and nearly all of them specialists. She pointed at the desert below. That wasn't a construction site. It was an organized city. They descended a short path that led to what archaeologists called the Craftsman's Gallery,
a long corridor of stone-lined rooms where ancient engineers once worked. Leila walked inside one chamber, running her hand across the smooth floor. This is where plans were drawn, where scribes stored measurements on papyri, where architects worked with geometry and astronomy. Tomas studied the faded hieroglyphs on the wall, lines, grids, angled patterns. Blueprints? Conceptually, Leila said. The Egyptians invented technical drawing. They used grid systems thousands of years before Rome or Greece adopted them. Every block, every angle, every surface of a pyramid was calculated long before the first stone was cut. She pointed to a symbol, a triangle intersected by horizontal lines. This is a seked, she explained. Their method of measuring slope. It allowed them to achieve the pyramid's perfect angle. She drew a quick version in the sand. Rise over run. Horizontal offset per cubit of vertical rise. Every engineer here studied it, memorized it, lived by it. Tomas traced the sand drawing. So this is how they controlled the pyramid's faces? Yes, she said. Without deviation, without guesswork. They moved to another chamber, this one littered with stone fragments, pigments, and broken tools. Sunlight filtered through a cracked ceiling, illuminating tight clusters of copper chisels arranged nicely along a ledge. These were not random tools. Every team had a specialist, one to sharpen, one to measure, one to mark the stone, one to lead the chiseling rhythm. Tomas nodded slowly. Division of labor. Exactly, Leila said. The Egyptians invented the production line long before factories. Another chamber held storage pits filled with rope remnants, wooden sleds, oil jars, and what looked like fragments of rulers. This is logistics, the beating heart of construction. She lifted a small wooden fragment. Do you know what this is? Tomas shrugged. Part of a staff? No, part of a surveying rod. They used rods marked with cubit intervals to maintain consistency across sites. She moved to a corner where remnants of a clay tablet sat cracked and fossilized. These scratches, their attendance records, daily tallies, food allotments. She lifted a small shard showing neat rows of symbols. Rations for quarry workers, beer, bread, onions, and garlic, enough to keep thousands of workers healthy. Tomas looked impressed. So even nourishment was calculated. Yes, Leila said, everything was. They stepped outside into the fading light. The desert wind carried the warmth of the day away, leaving a cool hush behind. Leila pointed toward a low series of stone buildings, barracks for the workers. These were not prisons. They had beds, storage rooms, even bakeries. Tomas blinked. Bakeries? Leila nodded. You can still see the circular ovens. They produced thousands of loaves a day. This was a functioning community.
As they approached the barracks, Tomas ran his fingers over the rough stone walls. People lived here, ate here, slept here, worked here. They were proud. They were, Leila said. Most of the graffiti inside reads like pride, workers carving their names beside the stones they placed. These men weren't anonymous. They wanted to be remembered. She took him deeper into the complex until they reached a wide circular pit in the ground. This was the central command court, she explained. Each morning, the overseers gathered here to assign shifts, distribute tools, update measurements. Tomas stood in the center, imagining the scene. Hundreds of men gathering at dawn, tools clinking at their belts, overseers shouting instructions, scribes recording everything.
So the pharaoh had engineers, he said slowly. Real engineers, not symbolic ones. Thousands, Leila confirmed. Surveyors, architects, rope experts, tool masters, chisel teams, dolerite pounders, polishers, haulers, rope braiders, boat builders, carpenters, mathematicians, astronomers. She lifted her gaze to the pyramids rising behind them, glowing gold in the sunset. You cannot build precision from chaos. You build it from coordination. They walked toward the plateau's edge, where a narrow ramp once connected the workers' village to the pyramid site. The slope was gentle but long, carved with deep grooves from centuries of sleds dragging stone. This ramp, Leila said, was the highway of an empire. Every block from the quarry came through here. Every measurement was checked here. Every stone was approved by inspectors here. They approached a small platform where several flat stones sat arranged by size. Some bore faint grid marks. Some had chalk lines still visible. This, she said, was the staging area. Here, the pharaoh's engineers checked each block before it was allowed to be placed. Tomas crouched, touching a faint mark on one block. Is this a rejection mark? Yes, Leila said. If a block failed, it was sent back to be reshaped. They had standards stricter than modern construction. He stood slowly. So this is how they achieved near-perfect joints. The engineers demanded it, Leila said. The workers delivered it. Together they created precision unmatched even today. She stepped closer to him, her voice softening. Tomas, the pyramids weren't built by brute labor. They were built by brains. Entire teams thinking, planning, measuring. And believing, Tomas said. Yes, Leila agreed. Believing deeply. Because to the Egyptians, the pharaoh wasn't merely a king. He was the axis between earth and sky. Building for him meant building for eternity. They turned toward the pyramids once more. Twilight had settled, and the first stars blinked into existence above the horizon. The limestone slopes glowed faintly, as if holding sunlight long after the sun had gone. The pharaoh's engineers, Leila whispered, designed time itself. Tomas nodded slowly, and the workers carved it into stone. The morning sun crept slowly across the desert floor, drawing long, thin shadows from every stone, ridge, and dune. It was early, too early for tourists, too early for most archaeologists, but Leila and Tomas were already awake, climbing a small rise east of the Great Pyramid. Leila carried nothing but a thin bronze rod and a length of knotted cord. Tomas carried a notebook, though he suspected he wouldn't need to write much. Some lessons, he found, carved themselves directly into memory. At the top of the ridge, the desert opened around them, vast, silent, ancient. The Great Pyramid loomed behind them like a jagged mountain, its edges catching the sun's first gold. Today, Leila said softly, we learn how the Egyptians measured with light. Tomas raised an eyebrow. We did geometry already. She smiled. Geometry on the ground. Now, geometry in the sky. She planted the bronze rod upright in the sand. The rod's shadow stretched long and thin, pointing west. A gust of wind swept through the ridge, rustling Leila's hair as she knelt next to the shadow.
This, she said, is a gnomon. A sunstick, Tomas said. A cosmic ruler, she corrected. She drew a long line following the shadow, marking its tip with a pebble. Then she sat back on her heels. "You know how the Egyptians aligned the pyramids so precisely?" she asked. Tomas shrugged. "Stars?" "Stars helped," she said, "but light finished the job." She angled her head toward the pyramid. The Great Pyramid is aligned within a tiny fraction of a degree to true north. Even with our modern equipment, that level of accuracy is difficult. Tomas frowned. How did they do it with no metal tools? Leila tapped the rod gently. "With this and patience." She stood and motioned for Tomas to watch the shadow closely. During the day, the shadow moves, but twice a day there's a moment the shadow forms a perfect line, once in the morning, once in the afternoon. Tomas nodded slowly. "A straight east-west line." "Yes," she said. "The Egyptians traced that line. Then they bisected the angle with a cord. That bisecting line pointed true north." She traced the imaginary lines with her hand, angles, intersections, invisible geometry written on sunlight. No compasses, no machines, just shadows. Tomas knelt, watching the moving shadow. It's elegant." "It's genius," Leila said, "because shadow never lies." She picked up the knotted cord and stretched it across the east-west mark she'd drawn. And to check the accuracy of stone surfaces, they used the same technique. She pointed to a nearby limestone block, half buried in sand. "Come here." Together, they brushed sand away. The surface revealed itself, worn by time but still astonishingly flat. "Now watch," Leila said. She laid the rod horizontally across the block. The shadow beneath it stretched into a narrow strip. If the shadow line was broken, the surface wasn't flat. If the shadow line was even, unbroken, uniform, she stepped back. Tomas let out a breath. "Then the surface is perfect." "Exactly." The shadow cast by the rod formed a razor-straight line across the limestone. No dips, no warps, no breaks. "This," Leila whispered, running her palm along the stone, "was polished 4,000 years ago. And it's still perfect." Tomas looked up at the pyramids rising behind them. "So light was their laser." Leila smiled. "Their most honest tool." She walked toward the foot of the rise, gesturing for Tomas to follow. They descended to a wide, level area once used as a construction yard. The sand here was thin. The ground beneath was ancient limestone pavement, flat, hard, and bright beneath the growing sun. This, she said, was a calibration yard. "Calibration?" Tomas repeated. "Yes. This is where they tested every stone for accuracy before sending it up the ramp." She pointed to faint grid marks carved into the limestone, lines forming rectangles, angles, triangles. These grids weren't decorative. They were measuring stations. The Egyptians placed stone blocks on the grid and checked the angle of their edges by watching how shadows fell on the lines. Tomas crouched, tracing the lines with his fingertips. He stared in silence for a long moment. "They used the sun like an instrument," he whispered. "Exactly. They used shadows as rulers, sunlight as a plumb line." She walked to a wall of limestone blocks stacked like benches along the edge of the yard. The surfaces bore faint patterns of intersecting lines, some straight, some slanted, some circular. This, she said, placing her hand on the worn stone, was a shadow workshop. Here, apprentices learned how to read the morning light, how to spot imperfections the eye alone couldn't see. She stepped aside and motioned for Tomas to join her. Here, she said, is how they shaped edges. She drew him toward a block whose corner was carved into a perfect, sharp angle. Clean, smooth, precise, even after centuries. Imagine a master mason, she said, holding a straight rod at the stone's edge. If the shadow fell unevenly, the apprentice knew exactly where to shave another sliver of stone. Shave? Tomas laughed. With what? Leila raised her eyebrow. Sand, water, and a copper blade. He exhaled, half in awe, half in disbelief. How many checks did they have to perform? Leila's smile was soft, almost sad. Thousands. She stepped back and looked toward the pyramid's luminous slope. You see those casing stones? She asked. Tomas nodded. Those polished faces aren't just smooth, they're aligned to fractions of a degree, checked and rechecked from sunrise to sunset. She pointed. At noon, the Egyptians used the shortest shadow of the day, what we call the solar zenith, to measure vertical surfaces. If the shadow disappeared completely behind a block, they knew the face was perfectly aligned. Tomas blinked. A shadowless check. Yes, she said. Where shadow vanished, perfection lived. A soft breeze carried grains of sand swirling around their feet. Leila closed her eyes, imagining the scene long ago.
Hundreds of workers lined up with rods. Overseers squinting at angles. Scribes marking deviations on papyrus. Engineers walking with cords stretched taut. Apprentices shouting corrections as the light shifted. Master masons shaving off fractions of millimeters. All guided by light. In the ancient world, she said quietly, light was thought to be divine. The sun was Ra, the creator, the source of rebirth. Tomas followed her gaze. So measuring with light was sacred. Yes, she whispered. To align stone with the sun was to align human work with divine order. They stood in silence for a moment as the sun climbed higher, strengthening the shadows around them. Then Tomas spoke. Leila, do you ever think the Egyptians knew something we've forgotten?
Leila smiled. All the time. She lifted the rod and let its shadow fall across the grid lines once more. We build with machines now, but machines obey commands, not intuition, not nature, not the rhythm of the sky. She let the rod drop softly into the sand. The Egyptians built with a dialogue between earth and sun, between worker and stone, between idea and eternity. Tomas closed his notebook. I think I understand now. Leila glanced at him. Understand what? That the pyramids weren't built to impress the future, he said softly. They were built to honor the light. Leila's eyes softened. And light, she said, honored them back. Night had fallen like a great dark curtain over the desert, smothering color, muting sound, swallowing the edges of the earth. Only the stars remained, brilliant, sharp, countless. They glimmered above the pyramids like ancient eyes, watching from a time before memory.
Leila and Tomas sat just outside their tents, warmed by the orange glow of a small campfire. Sparks drifted upward, growing for a moment before vanishing into the vast night. In the distance, the silhouettes of the pyramids rose like giants turned to stone mid-step. No wind, no noise, just the stillness of a world that had held secrets for too long. Tomas stared into the fire. "You know," he said quietly, "I get why people believe the Egyptians had help." Leila didn't look surprised. She pulled her shawl tighter around herself and nodded for him to continue. "Everything we've seen," Tomas said, "everything we've learned, it's incredible, almost unbelievable. The precision, the scale, the planning, the endurance. I studied engineering for years, and still, none of it feels possible." Leila smiled softly. "Because you're thinking like a modern engineer. Isn't that good? It's limiting," she said, "because we rely on machines. They relied on discipline." She picked up a handful of sand and let it fall through her fingers. "But you're right about one thing. What the Egyptians achieved feels superhuman." The fire crackled, sending a warm pulse through the cold desert air. Tomas leaned closer. "Do you ever think they had knowledge we lost, techniques we haven't discovered yet?" Leila's expression shifted, not dismissive, not skeptical, thoughtful. "I don't believe in aliens or hidden superpowers, but I do believe in forgotten science." She looked up at the stars. "The Egyptians didn't just cut stone. They studied it. They listened to it. They worked with it the way a musician works with an instrument. They knew aspects of material behavior we only rediscovered centuries later." She turned back to Tomas. "Knowledge isn't linear. It doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it loops. Sometimes it's lost." Tomas poked the fire. "Lost on purpose?" Leila paused. That was a heavier question than he realized. She stood and motioned for him to follow her a short distance away. They climbed a low ridge where the earth dipped into a natural hollow. There, half buried in sand, was something strange, something Tomas hadn't seen before. "What is this?" he asked. Leila crouched beside it. "It's an unfinished shaft," she said. "One of many. Archaeologists found dozens like this, perfectly straight cuts, then suddenly abandoned. The shaft plunged diagonally into the bedrock with geometric precision. Tomas shone his flashlight into it, and the beam disappeared into darkness. "How deep is it?" he asked. 40 meters, maybe more." And they stopped. "Why?" Leila ran her fingers along the edge of the shaft. "Because something changed. Something happened. A shift in leadership, a ritual, a disaster. Something we haven't uncovered." She tapped the shaft's wall lightly. "This cut was made using a technique we still haven't been able to replicate with certainty." Tomas stiffened. "What do you mean?" "Look at the pattern," Leila said. "Do you see the striations?" He leaned closer. The flashlight revealed repeating lines, tight, symmetrical, almost machine-like.
"These," she whispered, "are the marks that fuel speculation." Tomas stared. "These look like drill lines." "They do," Leila agreed, "but the shafts are too narrow for any large tool, and no ancient copper drill, no matter how long, could withstand the heat and pressure this depth requires." Tomas felt a chill. "So what made them?" "We don't know," she said softly,
Some think they used weighted copper tubes. Some say long bow drills powered by teams of workers. Others think the shape was carved through an abrasive slurry and years of repeated motion. She sat back on the sand, but none of those explanations fully matched the marks. Silence fell over them. The desert seemed to listen. After a long moment, Tomas spoke again. What about the precision in the king's chamber? The joints so tight you can't slide a knife between them. The granite beams weighing 60 tons lifted 70 meters above ground. Tomas exhaled slowly. That, she said, is why I say we're dealing with lost knowledge. She looked toward the Great Pyramid, its silhouette dominating the horizon. They did things we haven't fully reverse engineered, not because we lack intelligence, but because we lack context. We don't know how their minds worked. We don't know the philosophies driving their techniques. Their world wasn't shaped by convenience. It was shaped by devotion. She brushed sand from her hands and continued. We picture them as workers, but many were mathematicians, astronomers, artists, priests. They understood vibration the way we understand electricity. They understood alignment the way we understand code. She smiled faintly. They didn't need magic. They had mastery. Tomas sank into the sand beside her. But why abandon such knowledge? Leila hesitated, then spoke softly. Civilizations forget. Floods come. Dynasties fall. Libraries burn. Skills that require generations of teaching vanish in a single war. The fire flickered behind them. A faint breeze stirred the sand. Think of it, she said. What if we vanished tomorrow? What would survive? The sand would eat our cities. Our metal would rust. Our screens would die. But these stones? She gestured at the pyramids. They would remain, and whoever found them would wonder the same thing you're wondering now. She closed her eyes briefly, as though absorbing the ancient night. What survives isn't knowledge. It's questions. They sat quietly staring at the pyramids glowing faintly beneath the starlight. The ancient structures seemed to breathe with the desert, massive, unmoving, eternal. Finally, Tomas asked, So the Egyptians didn't need help? Leila smiled. They didn't need help because they were the help. He frowned. What does that mean? It means, she replied, they built beyond human limits, not with machines, but with something more powerful. Tomas leaned in. What? She looked at him, eyes reflecting the stars. Unity. He blinked. Unity? Imagine, she said, 40,000 people, architects, masons, farmers, priests, mathematicians, working not for paychecks, not for deadlines, but for belief, for eternity, for their pharaoh, for their gods. She gestured toward the pyramid again. That's how they built this, not with gears, not with aliens, with a shared vision so strong it outlived their bodies. Tomas stared silently at the desert. After a long while, he whispered, Maybe that's what we've lost. Leila nodded slowly. Maybe. The stars above shimmered brighter, cold and brilliant. The pyramids stood unmoving, guardians of mysteries older than memory. Beyond human hands? Leila murmured. No, crafted by human hands, but guided by something larger. She closed her eyes. Purpose.
The sun was dipping low when Leila and Tomas left the desert ridge. A soft twilight washed the Giza Plateau in shades of violet and gold, transforming the pyramids into colossal silhouettes, monuments caught between day and night, past and present. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of dust, stone, and the distant murmur of the city. Tomas walked beside Leila, quiet, contemplative,
They had spent days unraveling the mysteries of ancient craftsmanship, tools, geometry, light, sound, labor, and still, the deeper they went, the more they realized how vast the Egyptian world truly was. Finally, Tomas spoke. "What happened," he asked softly, "to all those skills, all those people? The master masons, the engineers, the stone cutters. Where did it all go?" Leila smiled faintly. "It didn't vanish. Not at once. Not completely." She led him across a causeway lined with old retaining stones, some cracked, some perfect, some still bearing the faintest strokes of ancient chisels. Their footsteps echoed in the quiet. Civilizations evolve. Dynasties rise and fall. Methods change. But knowledge travels. She stopped before a half-buried block of limestone whose surface was polished so finely it reflected the twilight sky. "Take this," she said, brushing sand from its edge. "This block was shaped 4,000 years ago. But the techniques, they spread far beyond Egypt." She pointed east, toward Nubia. The Kushite kingdom absorbed Egyptian craftsmanship when they ruled the south. Their temples were built by masons trained in Egyptian stonework. She pointed west. Across the desert trade routes, tools, mathematics, even architectural styles reached the Berbers, the Libyans, the caravan builders. She lifted her hand toward the north, and when Greece rose to power, it admired Egypt deeply. Greek scholars traveled here. They studied Egyptian mathematics, astronomy, even construction. Tomas tilted his head. "You're saying the Greeks borrowed from Egypt?" "Borrowed?" Leila laughed gently. "They devoured it. Euclid, the father of geometry, lived in Alexandria. Pythagoras studied in the Egyptian priesthood. Even Herodotus wrote that Egypt was the land of wonders." The wind swept through the plateau, stirring sands across ancient pavement. Leila continued. "And when Rome conquered Egypt, they took masons with them. Real masons, trained in quarrying, chiseling, polishing. Roman temples, baths, aqueducts, all were shaped by hands educated in the Egyptian tradition." She walked toward a steep rock ledge overlooking the Nile in the distance. "And then there was the greatest migration of knowledge, the translation movement of the Middle Ages. Egyptian mathematics, preserved by Greeks, passed into Arabic scholars' hands. They refined it, preserved it, expanded it." She smiled. "Many of our modern words, alchemy, algebra, come from that exchange. And beneath everything lies the Egyptian principle of measurement." Tomas leaned against a stone block, listening with fascination. "So, the legacy isn't just the pyramids, it's the knowledge that flowed outward." "Exactly," Leila said. She knelt and dragged her finger through the sand, drawing 3 shapes: a pyramid, a temple, and obelisk. These aren't isolated creations. They're chapters in a story that spans continents. She drew a 4th shape, a Greek column, a 5th, a Roman arch, a 6th, a medieval astrolabe, a 7th, a Renaissance drawing compass. Tomas watched the shapes appear in the sand like a timeline unfolding. So Egypt wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Leila nodded. "The Egyptians didn't work in isolation, Tomas. They inspired the world." The sun dipped further, casting long shadows across the plateau. The blocks around them glowed with the last rosy light of dusk. She stood and brushed her hands clean. "But it's more than technique, more than geometry, more than stone." She gestured toward the workers' cemetery they had visited earlier. "Look at them," she said softly. "These ordinary people carved monuments that outlived empires.
Their craft flowed across time, not because of the stones they shaped, but because of the values they embodied. Values? Tomas echoed. Yes, Leila said. Dedication, patience, precision, respect for materials, belief in something greater than oneself. She walked closer to the Great Pyramid, her pace slow, reverent. Those values didn't stay in the desert. They seeped into every culture Egypt touched. Stonecutters in Europe inherited their discipline. Architects inherited their obsession with alignment. Scholars inherited their devotion to measurement. And even now, she placed her palm against the pyramid's warm limestone surface. Engineers who build skyscrapers follow principles first laid here. Tomas joined her, touching the stone next to her hand. It felt impossibly solid, as though time could hammer upon it endlessly without leaving a mark. He whispered, "The world built upon this."
She gestured toward the vast landscape around them. It's about intention, devotion, discipline, a willingness to give time to something that might never be seen by the world but matters anyway. The wind shifted, swirling a small cloud of dust around their feet. The desert seemed to listen. When we cut corners, she said, when we rush, when we chase convenience, we lose something. The Egyptians didn't lose it, and that's why their work still stands. Tomas nodded slowly. So the miracle isn't the pyramids. No, Leila said gently. The miracle is the mindset. They walked along the base of the pyramid, each block towering above them like a silent chapter in an unwritten story. Birds glided overhead, the sun climbed higher, warming the stones. "Do you know what I realized last night?" Tomas asked. "What?" He said, "that we live in a world where everything is instant. Instant messages, instant meals, instant results. But these stones," he touched a block reverently, "these are the opposite. They ask for time. They reward patience." Leila smiled. "Exactly." He looked at her, his eyes thoughtful. "And maybe that's why we look at the pyramids with awe. Not because we can't build them now, but because we wouldn't." Leila's smile deepened. "Now you understand." They walked continued, passing ancient tool marks, faint inscriptions, and surfaces so flat they reflected the sunlight like mirrors. Everything around them felt impossibly old, yet strangely alive. "As archaeologists," Leila said, "we look for explanations. But explanations aren't the whole story. The Egyptians left us something deeper." She paused, searching for the right words. "They left us a philosophy carved in stone." Tomas nodded slowly. "A philosophy of doing things well. A philosophy of doing things slowly," she corrected, "of giving your best because it's worthy, not because it's easy. Of respecting nature, materials, and the limits of your own body." She picked up a small piece of limestone from the ground and held it up to the light. "This little stone," she murmured, "was once part of something bigger. It was shaped by hands that believed in their craft. It carries the echo of their effort, their breath, their heartbeat." Tomas watched her, the morning sun catching in her hair. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "what someone thousands of years from now will find from us?" Leila smiled wryly. "Plastic." They both laughed gently. "But I hope,"
she added, that somewhere, somehow, we leave something behind that shows patience, something that shows devotion. She glanced toward the pyramid again, a titan shaped not by power, but by persistence. The Egyptians, she said softly, remind us that perfection isn't a moment. It's an accumulation, 1,000 tiny actions repeated until they form something enduring. Tomas stepped closer. Maybe that's why we look at the pyramids with awe, not because we can't build them now, but because we wouldn't. It is human, Leila said. It's the most human thing imaginable, the desire to make something that outlives us, the hope that our hands can shape the future. A soft breeze brushed past them, carrying the smell of warm stone and sunlit sand. Leila let out a long breath. The pyramids, she said softly, aren't monuments to pharaohs. They're monuments to human possibility.
Tomas felt something shift inside him, something quiet, profound, and lasting. The sun rose fully now, bathing the desert in warm gold. The pyramids glowed brighter, their ancient faces illuminated by a new day, a fresh chapter of history, another sunrise in a chain of millions. And in that moment, beneath the towering stones that had endured earthquakes, wars, storms, and centuries, Leila and Tomas understood. The Egyptians didn't build for themselves. They built for time, and time remembered.